Hi everyone, thank you very much for being here to listen to this presentation. I'm going to be talking about practitioner perspectives on the role of sterilisation within DPM programs, and I'm hoping that this study will shed some light on what sterilisation programs can do, what they don't do, and what else might be important. And so the quote that I've used in the title here, "It's just one piece of the puzzle," that really sums up the key message that I hope will be taken away from this, and that is towards more of an understanding of how sterilisation fits into the bigger picture of DPM. So when we talk about DPM, what we mean is the multifaceted approach that encompasses many measures, of which reproductive control is only one. However, frequently there can be a focus on this particular aspect, and that can be a problem as it can lead to ineffective or unsustainable programs, maybe mismatched expectations of what is going to happen, and maybe not enough focus on other things that are causing long-term change or that might be needed. And I'm sure that everyone listening is very familiar with the reasons why sterilisation is used and the potential impacts it can have on dog population size and turnover, on the health, welfare and behaviour of dogs, and its potential role in human behaviour change as well. But previous research regarding this is conflicting, and the evidence that we have on both sides is based on a relatively small number of studies which tend to focus on single outcomes in specific areas, and so that fails to capture the sort of contextual factors or elements about how the program's conducted that might have contributed to success or otherwise. And there's also a huge amount of diversity in terms of the aims and capacity and contexts in which different programs are operating, so we can't assume that the same results in one area will be replicated in another. And so what we set out to do in this study was to try and get more of an understanding of how and why sterilisation might lead to change, which then might be adaptable to different settings. And in order to do this, we needed to use a qualitative approach. I think quantitative methods are much more common in DPM research, and so you're probably more familiar with that sort of work, but they can actually only tell us so much, and program success can't be measured in terms of the number of dogs sterilised or sterilisation coverage, and also not all the impacts that we want can be measured quantitatively. So qualitative research asks different questions and is more concerned with making sense of how things work in the real world. It can sometimes help in explaining quantitative findings or in uncovering unexpected issues that can then be pursued in further research. So we talked to 15 programme staff members from 12 different organisations, and we purposely selected participants who were likely to have wide-ranging experiences, so they were from diverse geographical settings, working with dog populations with different characteristics in terms of if they were owned or unowned or community owned, and different densities of dog population. There were also differences in what the main problems were perceived to be, and also in the types of strategies that were used. And they'd been working on sterilisation programs for between 3 and 27 years, so there was quite a range in that as well. And the interviews were semi-structured in that there was a guide with a set of questions that we developed around why sterilisation was used and their experiences of this. But the interview was flexible enough so that if the participant wanted to talk about a particular issue, then this was possible. Each interview was transcribed and then thematically analysed, which involves reading and rereading the data and looking for ideas, patterns and connections that emerge across them. These are then developed into broader themes which represent key issues, and that's what I'll be talking about in the findings. So from the interviews we developed 4 themes, and I'll talk through each of these in turn, and what I've done is included quotes from the participants to sort of illustrate what we found. And the first theme centred around emphasising the complexities of understanding the problem fully, and I think it's quite well summed up in this first quote from one participant who said that what they felt had happened is that they'd really tried to fix the problem without establishing what that problem actually was. There could also be different perspectives on what the root causes of any problems were. This might be a result of not knowing how many dogs there were initially, and what the main sources of free roaming dogs were, what might be maintaining the population, and also just if there really was too many dogs to begin with, or if it was more of a problem with the behaviour or perceived risk from those dogs. So this is touched on in the second quote. And then finally, these different perspectives also meant that there sometimes wasn't a consensus on either what the programme should be doing or actually where it should be heading and what the ultimate aims were, and this could be a challenge as well. The second key finding was around experiences of where sterilisation hadn't led to expected outcomes, and sometimes people talked about this idea of sort of being on a treadmill, where they felt that you had to keep going with what the sterilisation programme, because if you stopped operating in an area, then the population didn't take long to rebound to where it had been before. It was also found in areas that had long-running interventions that they sometimes came to a point where it was difficult to make any further inroads into decreasing population size or increasing the proportion of sterilised animals despite their sustained efforts. And different reasons were suggested for this. They probably are different reasons in different places, or at least of different importance, but some of the things that were mentioned were things like abandonment of owned dogs, migration due to environmental resources, human-mediated movement, and increased reproductive success of unsterilised dogs. And this sort of leads on from the previous theme, because once the problem is understood as complex and multifactorial, it makes sense that there are limitations to what sterilisation can achieve on its own, and therefore that other strategies are needed to address other potential sources of free roaming dogs or other problems that are associated with them. So this is touched on in the third quote you can see here, where it's talked about that sterilised dogs can still bite people, they can still be a public health risk, they can still transmit diseases and have poor welfare, and so even in the short term, sterilisation might not be meeting all of the objectives that are intended. So the third theme looked at the benefits that people had experienced from conducting sterilisation, and what I thought was really interesting here was that actually most of the time that was spent talking about this was linked to changes in the human population rather than the dog population. So changes in body condition score and reduction in certain health issues and longevity were mentioned, but some of these things were also then linked to a subsequent change in how humans perceive the dogs. So this is what's being talked about in the first quote here, where one of the participants talks about people preferring healthier looking dogs. But then there were other changes that seemed to be more just as a result of the sterilisation procedure being done, and that seemed to change how dogs were perceived or valued. And the changes that had been seen were sort of increased ownership type behaviours, such as dogs being given names or having collars put on them, or just more responsibility being taken. So one example was people more proactively actually seeking sterilisation for new dogs, which is obviously a great sign for sustainability and long-term change. Then the final set of findings highlighted what else was seen as important for success, and despite the diversity in programmes that I mentioned earlier, There are a number of factors that were shared and are consistently mentioned, and these were things like community engagement and collaboration, building trust and relationships with other stakeholders. And that was really important also for trying to make sure that everyone was on the same page. If this wasn't the case, then this could be a barrier to success. So in the second quote here, you can see one participant describing how sometimes the government decided to round up and shelter large numbers of dogs, despite many of them having been sterilised, and this obviously would have a negative effect on what the programme was trying to do. Finally, building local veterinary capacity seemed to be an important component, and this was not only considered to contribute to the improvements seen in dog health and welfare, but also to contribute to human behaviour change, as it seemed to create a sort of enabling environment where people felt like there was something they could do if a dog was ill or injured, which then might mean that they were more likely to create a bond with that animal. So, in conclusion, the findings really highlight the need to think beyond sterilisation as a simple solution for what is obviously a very complex problem. And the term wicked problem is sometimes used to describe these sort of problems where there is a tendency to focus on an aspect of the problem that's manageable rather than addressing the root causes. And our findings sort of suggested that the use of sterilisation could be seen as an example of this. And so what we really need to do is to understand just how that fits into the bigger picture, and to do this it is important to recognise its limitations, and then we can think about what else is needed. This might include elements of how the programme is planned and conducted, as well as the necessity for other components like providing veterinary care, developing local capacity, and involving other stakeholders as needed. And then just finally, I'd like to suggest that there might be a greater role that qualitative research can play in contributing useful evidence to help develop, implement and evaluate DPM programmes in the future. So this study was part of a PhD project. I'd like to thank my supervisors at the University of Nottingham and also Dogs Trust for funding the project, and finally thank you to all of the participants who took the time to be interviewed for the study. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.